So good morning, good afternoon. Thanks for joining. A very warm welcome to today's webinar hosted by BioPhorum. Today's session is centred around a recent publication from our single-use programme titled the BioPhorum Interchangeability Assessment and Qualification Best Practice Guide. My name is Louisa Mitchell and I have the privilege of facilitating this single-use programme at BioPhorum and in supporting the incredible work done by its members. I'm delighted to welcome our panel of speakers today who were also core authors of the publication. So we have Ken Wong, Critical Material Lead at Sanofi, Lee Stevens, Senior Global MSAT Engineer at Thermo Fisher, Sonia Schwantes, Market and Technology Development Director at New Age Industries, Shadi Mokyulu, Regional Business Development Manager at Watson Marlow Fluid Technology Solutions, and Monica Cardona, Global Senior Programme Manager, Single-Use Programmes at MilliporeSigma. And also supporting the webinar today is my colleague and fellow facilitator, Olivia Paisley. You can download the publication that we're highlighting today and many others from bioforum.com using the QR code that is provided here. So before I hand over to our speakers today, I'd like to briefly introduce you to BioPhorum for those of you who may not know us yet. So we were established in 2008, and BioPhorum is the global collaboration of choice. Our members include many of the largest industry organisations, and we have a vast array of ongoing industry collaborations. Our mission is to create an environment where our members can connect, collaborate, and accelerate progress for the benefit of all. BioPhorum members share complicated challenges that may be in the process of making biopharma drugs, in developing new gene therapies, or licensing a combination product. And we build the best solutions to those challenges together. Our powerful, proven collaboration model makes everyone's journey better, faster, and cheaper, and the decisions made in BioPhorum collaborations are highly influential, providing one voice for the industry. As mentioned earlier, the publication we're highlighting today was developed by a workstream in our single-use programme. That programme has been active for over a decade and encompasses a series of work streams dedicated to the supply, qualification and application of single-use technologies across the biopharma value chain. Our membership includes representatives from both single-use suppliers and end users from our drug substance and supply resilience forums, fostering a truly collaborative environment. The mission of our single-use programmes is to serve as the industry's collective voice in establishing best practices and shaping standards for the agile use of single-use technologies. And we have a vision of a future where single-use continues to enable the rapid, safe, sustainable and responsible delivery of therapeutics to patients. We all thank you very much for your attendance and participation today. If you're interested in learning any more about BioPhorum's work in the single-use space or the wider BioPhorum work, please feel free to reach out to me at louisa.mitchell@bioforum.com. I think you've heard enough from me, so with that, I am delighted to introduce our first speaker today, Ken Wong.
Thank you so much. Next slide. All right, so as mentioned today, we're going to be introducing a pretty new concept here, interchangeable parts or interchangeability of single-use components in the industry. This stems from the pandemic time when we urgently need a component that can be substituting as an alternate to what we are trying to get for production. Interesting enough, it's still going to be valuable in today's condition and situation we are in. So first, I want to show appreciation for our participant from 12 biopharma company in this workstream, as well as 12 single-use supplier. After some intensive work and lengthy discussion of the definition that we use in the industry, we finally have this publication to share with you as a best practice. So in today's application here that you download, you will see the definition that we have, how we categorize the interchangeability within a framework of 4 category models. And then in there, we also provide some examples of proactive and reactive scenario, how you approach interchangeability activity within your company, as well as strongly emphasizing the collaboration between the end user, sometimes CDMO as well, and also the supplier in these transactions. And a strong requirement is to have a very clear user requirement in this conversation. We also share some of the implementation scheme in the publication, as well as some component and case studies in this publication. So next, let me pass it to our next speaker. Sardine, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Ken. In the following section, I'll be discussing the problem statement and the solution that's been developed as a best practice by the industry. As we know, single-use systems have been widely used within the biopharmaceutical sector, and their usage is still expanding. The long history of evolution by each supplier and end user has led to a complex supply chain with numerous requirements. However, during the pandemic years, this extremely complex network was disrupted. There still remains issues with fragmented evaluation standards across the industry, and there's no industry-wide consensus on how to evaluate or qualify single-use components. There are operational and supply chain vulnerabilities when there are disruptions, which can lead to costly delays. Without a shared guidance or framework, there's ineffective change management, which increases the burden on internal resources and provides regulatory risk. So the BioPhorum working group determined there had to be a solution to this. Current single-use assembly parts are often extremely optimized for each end user's requirements to best fit their different assemblies. The requirements can vary from company to company, a little like the saddle posts of highly customized bikes. However, when there are two or more parts that could fulfill an end user's requirement, they could be termed as interchangeable. In this example, it could be viewed in the same way as similar portable USB batteries that are interchangeable because their functional requirement is being fulfilled. In order to determine that two or more components are interchangeable, specific user requirements and requisite agreements between the supplier and end user are key. It's a given that the interchangeable component already meets predetermined regulatory and quality attributes. In addition to the highly complex safety and regulatory requirements, company-specific requirements are frequently seen. The availability of single-use components directly impacts the supply chain of drug manufacturing and drug products, and hence it's important to be considered. General interchangeability relies on the determination of three factors: fit, form, and function. Fit means the connectivity to other parts. Function means the dimension. Form, means the dimension, and function means what is expected of the parts. But these are not the only aspects to be considered during the assessment. For pharmaceuticals, specific aspects such as E&L, toxicity assessment also need to be evaluated. And this is why an industry-wide discussion was needed for selecting interchangeable parts assessments. Some are common requirements to the end users and some are company-specific. The concept of interchangeability requires the supplier to provide consistent, comprehensive data for the end user to assess and compare single-use components quickly and accurately, thereby reducing the uncertainty and time constraints when evaluating potential substitutes. This is a collaborative process between the supplier and end user to ensure continued supply of the single-use equipment, thereby reducing the risk of drug manufacturing shortages. This guide recommends how these attributes should be considered during the assessment. To be more specific, in pharmaceutical manufacturing, changes can be divided into 4 categories. The first category is where there are no changes to the parts itself, such as a change to the parts certification. The second category is like for like. An example of this would be sanitary connectors, where specification has been long known and there are many component suppliers who manufacture similar parts. The third category would be functional modification. This category is most frequently seen. And the fourth category would not be recognized as being interchangeable because the change leads to functionally unequivalent product, which leads the end user to having to revalidate the usage. What is considered to be interchangeable are the two middle cases, namely like for like and functionally equivalent. For a like-for-like example, this is frequently found in catalog parts, such as clamps and connectors that have been well defined using ISO, DIN, or ASME standards. For example, the hose barb ferrules that have been supplied by several component manufacturers. In the functional equivalent case, there are more factors to consider, but in essence, the function must be kept and it must be the same. In the example in the slide, both vent filter capsules may differ in many aspects. However, they must be capable of sterile gas filtration. The functional equivalent case is more drastic because the user requirement is necessary to determine what is critical. Change management to implement interchangeable parts can be done in two ways, either proactive or reactive. In the proactive example, the supplier and the end user defined interchangeable options before the parts are at risk. For the reactive case, the interchangeable parts are added as an option when the supply of the initial component is already at risk. With both cases, there will be the same change control processes that exist between supplier and end user. In the proactive change control, this would be initiated under agreement between the end user and supplier, whereas the reactive case would be initiated by the supplier. In the proactive case, defining the interchangeable options is considered during the initial design phases. Whilst the selection of options will add additional work in the beginning to both supplier and end user, it will help to ensure a secure supply of assemblies than in the reactive case. In short, the proactive cases secures interchangeable parts in advance to mitigate supply chain shortage or delay. The reactive case was issued by many assembly suppliers in the COVID pandemic years. Parts at risk were compared with the remaining options and change notifications were issued. Usually, the pre-change agreement is very hard between the supplier and the end user because the evaluation time is extremely short. In these cases, options provided are limited and urgent evaluation is required to secure delivery. Now that I've described the problem statement and the proposed industry solution, I will hand over to Monica to discuss the benefits to the supplier. Over to you, Monica.
Thank you. So the benefits to suppliers of single-use assemblies would be definitely flexibility, right? It would give us an additional option or benefit when it comes to efficiency of internal and external supply chain management. It'll provide or facilitate improved demand planning and consistency in stock of components because you have options of stocking more than one component. It would reduce rework time. So if you have proactively qualified components to be interchangeable, when there is a shortage or supply chain disruption, you don't have to invest the time in, like an engineering assessment in order to ensure that the component you want to interchange is compliant to your organization's design rules, for example. So what does this reduce rework lead to is improved response time for supply disruption. And ideally, if you have these pre-approved interchangeable components, it gives you consistency and flexibility. And also, improved, lead time reliability, not necessarily shorter lead time, but being able to reliably meet your published lead time because you have these interchangeable components. That being said, right, regardless of how much you try to risk mitigate by having these interchangeable components, it doesn't overshadow or preclude the necessity for accurate forecasting, right? If you don't have accurate forecasting, interchangeable components is not going to help that, right? Whether your assemblies are custom or standard. So there's supplier-driven interchangeability, end user driven interchangeability. But at the end of the day, it really is a partnership. And I think that's one of the things that this paper really does. It sort of gives us a level playing field that we're all speaking the same language and managing expectations of what this interchangeability would look like, what is required, what would a minimal viable comparability package look like for interchangeability. So it's definitely not something that is just ordered by the supplier. It is most definitely a collaboration between both suppliers and end users. So let's look at maybe supplier-driven interchangeability. One of the easiest places maybe to start with the interchangeability maybe is for these standard systems that are off-the-shelf catalog numbers that traditionally can be purchased online. These systems, do have the same level of quality documentation that you would require to bring the assemblies into your facilities. But since it's a standard part number, when you are purchasing it, you would be made aware that the supplier has risk mitigated and that you would be getting interchangeable components from the onset. So this one is more proactive versus reactive because that interchangeability is built into the supply chain, right? Then, as we know, our regardless of all of the different suppliers having programs to maybe standardize or minimize similar design proliferation, we know that every supplier has perhaps a list of preferred components. And when you design your assembly, using your suppliers, being aware of your supplier's preferred components and designing with those preferred components will offer you, in most cases, the highest level of qualification and documentation. It also means that these preferred components are the ones that your supplier is most likely to have on stock and on the shelf. And standard systems usually have the shortest lead time. Designing custom assemblies with preferred components has a reduced lead time versus a custom assembly. But for the preferred components, right, there's also options for interchangeability. Custom would be those where you would have to, they would have the longest lead time. There is design flexibility. There is extended lead time. And here, the idea is that in most cases, if you want to risk mitigate with component interchangeability, this would have to be agreed upon by your supplier and yourselves at system design. So possibly having variable bill of materials or another method where you can have full traceability. In all three instances, right, they have different levels of complexity in order to execute and in order to be able to provide interchangeability with full traceability. But regardless of standard assemblies or assemblies with preferred components or fully customized assemblies, having that flexibility of component interchangeability offers time savings to our end users. And so now let's talk about the challenges, right? Because it all sounds very good. So why doesn't everybody offer it? Why didn't we think of this sooner? I must say that the pandemic did help, definitely did help, because I think our industry moved from we can't change anything to the pendulum switch, went all the way to the other end where everybody was maybe at one point scrambling for a specific component, to produce. And so we learned that there could be a framework for this interchangeability. However, digital tools are necessary, right? So regardless of, the size of the supplier, we are all in, different stages of the digitization journey. And the digitization journey does have an impact on the ability to be able to offer this, right? So some suppliers have smart configurators where you can probably maybe choose your interchangeable components at the design stage, and not everybody may be having those digital tools. The other thing is data accessibility. Um, what type of information is available? The traceability that we would need for all these components, how we store and manage that data is also important. And being able to provide the information readily, right? It's not just having it, it's having these tools that can help offer that digital infrastructure to reinforce the behavior and make people comfortable with interchangeability. And there is a cost. There is a cost to interchangeability, because true interchangeability, it doesn't mean that we qualify, let's say, 2 air filters or 2 gaskets or 2 clamps, but we continue to purchase from our preferred supplier for those components, right? Because if your supply disruption comes, you can't wait for the supply disruption to be at your doorstep to go to the other qualified supplier that you have not been purchasing from all along. So true interchangeability means that you are consistently purchasing those interchangeable components from 2 different suppliers, right? And that your end user will not just accept receiving that component interchanged when there's a disruption, but that they have agreed to interchangeable components in order to ensure business continuity, supply chain robustness. So steps to implementation, standard offering, right? Always looking, and this not only goes for interchangeability, but I think for across the board in single use, right? When looking at the single use unit operation, looking at what your supplier has off the shelf prior to embarking on designing something custom is the preferred way to go. Because that is the place where most of your suppliers would already have looked at this interchangeability. The next step is, ensuring, you can become familiar with your supplier's preferred components and that you are designing with your supplier's preferred components. Now, we spent a lot of time as a work stream, coming up with definitions, coming up with a framework that both end users and suppliers could agree to in order to provide this benefit. So I really cannot emphasize enough that the way that interchangeability can work and has become a reality at some suppliers and at some end users is really following this BioPhorum guidance and agreeing to it and sticking to it in order to be able to successfully provide these interchangeable components. Now, my colleague Sade gave you the definitions of the different levels of how we categorized interchangeability. And I think the first step when we look at interchangeability of components, both for the supplier and the end user, is you need to buy into these two definitions. Otherwise, the program won't work, right? These, the like for like and functional equivalent, they're pretty much set in stone. And this is what would enable us to be successful and manage each other's expectations going forward. So establish an interchangeability program, it's pivotal for supply chain. It does have a cost associated with it. So this is not something that is necessarily free. But I think if we can agree to the BioPhorum framework, it does, help us have a more resilient supply chain. It does help manage expectations on that change management process and what documentation you will receive. And it is, it's data driven, and it really, if we follow the framework, it'll set us both up for success. So the main things, right, that are critical is to ensure that everybody sticks to the industry aligned definitions and that the defined quality attributes and the expectations on the data that is required for the evaluation of interchangeability that we share in this paper, and some of the examples that my colleagues will provide later on, that you see that this is really what is going to lead to success, and where once we were very, very change averse, right? That we haven't, as an industry, have grown and have embraced interchangeability, and this is the perfect framework to make us successful. Now, there's sort of maybe an interception between standardization and interchangeability, right? And in this case, we're not necessarily promoting standardization per se, but standardization would also benefit from interchangeability, and that's where we would probably get the most flexibility overall. So from a supplier's perspective, if my end users can read this paper, share it with their quality and their regulatory departments, if they can embrace the framework and set expectations for what types of data to expect to evaluate interchangeability, I think that would set us all up for success and would enable more suppliers to embark on proactively looking at interchangeable components. I'm going to hand over to Lee.
Great. Thank you very much, Louisa. So I'm kind of turn the page and talk about the benefits from an end user perspective. So my name is Lee Stevens, and I'm from Thermo Fisher Scientific, but within the CDMO business. So that's why I'm looking at it from like a manufacturing side of things. Let's go to the next slide here. So a lot of the benefits are relatively intuitive, but let's talk about three main ones. And I'll start with supply chain resilience. this is very similar to what Monica mentioned from the supplier perspective, and it applies also for end users of the material. So as was mentioned, if we have interchangeability, if we've established that and we're working with our suppliers on that, then we're going to maybe not always have shorter lead times, but we should have reliable lead times because our suppliers are able to mitigate disruptions and we don't even need to know about it. It just the parts come. So that's really a great benefit. Even at the manufacturing site, though, it allows further opportunity to make modifications. And so it may not be an identical material. It may not be a like-for-like material, but if we have a way to mitigate a disruption using a functionally equivalent material, and we're confident that we can use this material and we can manage the assessment appropriately, then that gives a lot of empowerment to the manufacturing site to control their own destiny, quality, and delivery and the compliance aspects as well. So just a couple of bullets here. Manage stockouts, manage defects. If there's an issue that's unforeseen, we can quickly and adeptly evaluate other options that would meet the requirement. Part of that is also because it's a structured and proceduralized assessment, we can just do it quicker because it's already been defined. Folks are trained on the procedure, and it's not a big fire every time something happens and it feels novel. And you guys have probably been there. You solve these problems and you feel like, well, I've already solved this problem before, but I have to start from the beginning and explain it to everyone from every time. And so when we can proceduralize these things from an end user perspective, it just allows that process to flow more smoothly. Second thing around, after supply chain resilience, or maybe before supply chain resilience, is quality in general. So I feel very strongly about this aspect actually because we learned in the collaborative sessions with all these different companies is that we are ultimately accountable to our patients and to the health authorities to ensure that what we do does not compromise safety, patient safety, right? And so many times you can do these assessments ad hoc, reactive, proactive, but if we're not asking all the right questions and we're not assessing all the right things because maybe there's an unknown, maybe we didn't know that should be checked, there's a risk of impact. And so by working with this team and really getting such a diverse perspective on how to assess and evaluate these changes, we can now have confidence that our evaluation process, the one that's prescribed in the article, is actually quite complete and comprehensive when it comes to the compliance or health authority regulatory expectations. And by proceduralizing it, we can ensure that we're doing all of the necessary steps every time. So it really does promote great quality in the assessments and the evaluations that we do, and such that any change we make will not affect the end product. The last element is more of a efficiency, waste reduction angle. So we got resilient and reliable lead times. We're not affecting quality. But in addition to those things, we're also trying to be a little bit more leaner from an organization perspective. We can mitigate things like scrap and expired materials because we don't have to stock up as high because we have this reliability. And if you've got aging material, perhaps you can use that in this process in the same way as an interchangeable part. This one that's almost expired, I can interchange it into my process and use it up before it becomes expired, and that brings costs down. That keeps materials out of the landfill, and so it's the things that we should be doing. We can bring down inventory levels. We can reduce the firefighting, the morale drain. Folks that have been on that side, they know that it makes it for a difficult day when you have to deal with these issues versus when it's just a procedure or a checklist and you're just filling it out. and it's very smooth and controlled, and you know, I think it meets expectations of our customers as well. So that efficiency is really important. And I guess I'll mention here as well, we've talked a lot in our group about dual sourcing, and this article doesn't go into dual sourcing, but this is a bit of a window into dual sourcing in that opportunity where we can you know, take advantage of supply chain you know, levers that are used in virtually all the other industries that are more mature than ours, and this is a way in to get there, to get to those standards. So with that said, I am going to hand it over to Sonia to talk about the supplier case study.
Thanks, Lee. So we ended up writing a case study that actually was going along as we were writing the paper. So a lot of what was going on in the case study was part of what we ended up putting in the paper in terms of the supplier side of or perspective of this. So we wanted to collaborate with our end user, of course, to understand what we were trying to do in terms of interchangeability. And at this point, we actually didn't have a definition for interchangeability. So part of this was, along with the work stream, defining what interchangeability was to us and to the end user in this case, because that was going to give us at least our baseline of what we wanted to look at in terms of the types of components, what kind of characteristics we needed to see, you know, and having that discussion with the end user to go through all of that and defining it very clearly. Interchangeability is interesting because you now have something to compare it to. Usually when you validate something, you're not necessarily comparing it to something else. You understand the performance you're getting and you kind of adjust around that. In this case, we had to meet the performance of the other components that we were looking at, and we weren't always sure exactly how to do that. You know, we had done all of the due diligence at the front end with the biocompatibility, the regulatory, you know, the functional testing, that kind of thing. But we were trying to make sure that we didn't accidentally miss something that we didn't think about when we initially had done the design of the assembly. So we looked at this and started with probably what we thought was the simplest kind of things like pinch clamps and tri-clamps, where that should be fairly straightforward in that, and created you know, the kind of the supplier side of things. What we learned is a lot of this really depends on the capabilities of your supplier. Our ERP system had specific limitations that we had to work with, and we ended up actually learning a lot about our ERP system with some of the functionality that we had not used previously, but found that was very useful when we were trying to set up the process for interchangeability. We then had to create a specification around that interchangeable component to bring it in, so that if we wanted to add in more components, we knew what we had to ask for from both our own supplier and ourselves in terms of testing for form, fit, and function. So that was a new process for us in how you do something like that. Now, this actually impacted every function as it goes through the different hands to make sure that when you get something, what the you know, employer, the operator out there is doing in terms of assembly, it may not actually look the same on the drawing if you're trying to use different components. And so we had to make sure that we were very, very clear in our work instructions that yes, there could be something that changed. That didn't mean that there was a quality issue with it, but we wanted to make sure our operators knew that there was a possibility that they could see a different component come through on the same assembly that they may have been doing for several years. So all of those types of details are really kind of what came up as we were going through this process, details that we didn't necessarily think about until you started actually doing the process. And then you start to understand that there's a lot that goes into ERP. So your IT function is very important. You know, your procurement has to be well informed about what's going on, what's acceptable, what they need to do, and what actually starts this process. When do you see this checkbox that interchangeability is needed? And can you put that in at several places in the process? Because sometimes interchangeability isn't needed at the front end until you're getting closer to actually manufacturing the assembly, and you realize that either something is late, something ran out, or something else has happened, and you can actually activate the interchangeability further in the process. So these are all details that came out as we were working through it. Again, this will differ based on your own capabilities as a supplier, your own software and functionality of the ERP system, how your processes work. But definitely the details are what really caused more of the headache than anything else. So it was a lot of learning as we went along with this, but we did gain quite a bit of ground in this, and it really helped, I think, in writing the paper as we looked at all of those types of things. So the supplier themselves, as you set up a interchangeability program, is not the only one that has responsibilities. When we talked about actually getting all of these things in place, we realized that, of course, as you're an end user receiving the products that look different or are different, you had to have some awareness about what you were receiving and that it was going to be okay, so that quality didn't flag it for some reason. So there was a lot of discussion about what does the end user need to see, what do we need to supply, the traceability of all of these types of things. And so that we had to put some ground rules about what we were going to do. For example, we wanted to make sure that every lot used the same component. We were not going to have interchangeable components within one lot. And that was just a decision that we made for our own traceability purposes, and obviously makes traceability much easier in that sense. So sometimes we had to have ground rules that we developed with the end user based on our own systems. And so we had to make sure that all of these things were done with the idea, of course, that future state, we would not have to send a change notification if we were going to do interchangeability within the drawings. All of that was agreed to at the front end. We started this process with drawings that had already been in existence, and so we did have an initial change notification that went out to update everything. We chose different options. We looked at the different options in terms of what we wanted to be able to show, and so our drawings now have a bill of materials that show all of the interchangeable components for the end user's awareness, so they know what they can get. And that was, again, a decision based on our systems, what we needed to do to make sure that we had clarification on our end, and making sure that the end user saw what they needed to see when they were going to accept this, in this case, a change, and also in the end, the different interchangeable components as they came in. So overall, I mean, it really was a shared set of responsibilities, depending on what you can and cannot do within your systems, and depending on what the end user needs to see when they receive things, or their awareness of the interchangeability. All of those are discussions that need to happen. And so this can happen both proactively and reactively. Proactively, of course, gives you the advantage of setting all of this up at the front end and then not having to worry about it further down. But it can be done reactively with the idea that in the future, you no longer have to receive all of those changes and try to make sure that you don't miss somebody's change notification for a component you didn't realize was going to be an issue, or trying to get that to the right person. Maybe it's an old email, maybe something was missed along the line. So this is a really helpful solution to set up with your supplier. But it really, as Monica mentioned, does take a lot of collaboration and the understanding of what the limitations might be, and those might be different from supplier to supplier. So it was a great learning experience, and we definitely hope that you'll get a lot out of the work that we put into this whole thing. So with that, I will pass it on back to Ken.
Thank you so much. So we're going to take the chance to look into the other side of the impact from end user perspective. And in the document, before I start, so in the document, I lay out the whole set of tables which are common quality attributes that we want to get that information as part of the interchangeable parts of qualification activities. So the first two tables here that I'll go through will be basically listing out all the components expectation for interchangeable parts from quality perspective. So many of these are applicable regardless what component you're going to look into. So from a parent standpoint, for example, it might be critical to you in some cases where you need to get this prototype in-house to do dimensional checks to make sure it fit into your process line, the building that you're in, and the operation, as well as looking at potentially you need to have a set of operating procedure for your operators, some written and then training as well. And then in terms of operating pressure standpoint, this is particularly important when you're dealing with high pressure applications. And everything else here listing are pretty common across the board. And then the next slides are also typical expectation from quality perspective as well. So there's not much different there. One thing that we put a note on the side here is the junction qualification. This one is not in most publication in the past. And we found out this is critical, especially when you have high pressure application in your assessment. So I'll get to some of those in my case studies. So the first one we'll look at in this case study will be vent filter. And in our case here, we approach this problem through reactive mode and also on a proactive mode simultaneously in our situation. So in terms of vent filter, it could be a single-use component by itself, and then it could be the vent filter in assembly. So in the component, it could be just the vent filter or in your bioreactor tank or from the canister, any container that you use. In terms of the assembly, it could be the vent filter in your filter assembly or your bag assembly. So in this case, in the publication, you'll see that if it's dealing with filter, it has additional attribute that you want to consider, and most of them are listed here. So in terms of design and fit, this is important to us, obviously, for dimension check, and then as well as in our case, we have three different unique cases that I want to share. So one has to do with the flow impact potentially. So this is related to the vent filter in the bioreactor, because we monitor the pressure in the process throughout for the current process. We want to make sure the change of the vent filter, even though we have the flow rate, will still not impact the profile that we have observed in the past. So we run some study just to compare as part of the acceptance. And in the other one is used near the filling operation, where the vent filter temperature compatibly is slightly near our basically autoclave cycle range. So because of fear of potential failure, we actually run the APS test to demonstrate that the sterility can be maintained if we do change this to a different vent filter. And the last one is another vent filter in the bioreactor system in the room, where is it pretty tight. So the alternate vent filter that we are looking at for interchangeable port is slightly bigger than what the previous one is. So we have to basically make an elbow to put that into the room where you can now fit this alternate vent filter in the line in the room. The second case study here would be in tubing. Again, we are also approaching this reactively as well in some cases proactively in this situation. So the tubing could be in assembly, and most of the time is in the assembly the way we buy our single use in a process. So it could be a filter or bag assembly or tubing manifold. So in the publication, you see for component like tubing, you have a set of attributes you want to consider. And junction qualification is one of the important ones that listed here, even if you change the feeding or fastener as well. So all the other are pretty common for tubing data that you will get from Supplier. So in terms of junction qualification, this is a fairly new expectation from us based on a past experience that have failure, especially dealing with high pressure application. I'll get into that when I get into the last case study. The third one will be the tube clamp. In this case, the tube clamp could be a component that you buy on your own and or in an assembly as well. So like a bag assembly, the filter assembly or manifold. So in this case, we look at the locking mechanism, which could be different from the current design, as well as the comparability to the tubing of the ODS or the wall thickness that we are using in the design. So we are getting a lot of data, hopefully from the supplier, if they have that to demonstrate, you can hold the pressure and duration for the period that we want to evaluate. In some cases, if they don't have enough of the data to justify, we may have to perform some of the study in-house, which we have done in some cases. So ideally, we want to have an identical design, especially the locking mechanism, but it doesn't have to be, as long as the function is there to allow you to stop flow if that's all you need, or to be able to hold the pressure for duration of the period. All right, so here's the last case study. This is the liquid filter, and this is also in some cases a reactive. In our cases, currently are more on the proactive mode that we are in currently. So it could be a single-use component, which is a cartridge or capsule, or single-use assembly is the filter assembly here. So from the attribute that we want, right? If it's just a filter, you just need to look at the filter attributes. If you are looking at the change in the assembly, you also need to include tubing, fastener fitting. So the junction testing is included in this case. So the reason I mentioned that the junction criteria is important. So in our past, because of filter assembly will face high pressure in the application, especially in the integrity testing situation, we actually run some study during the COVID period. And the interesting is that the component was evaluated by the supplier. It passed the internal qualification, but then it failed in our test. And this was only happened one time. It actually happened through 3 different suppliers. So overall, we do notice some weakness in the junction test program. And because it's not an industry standard, it's more important to us to really understand how they actually perform the test and how we perform the test so that we can share information with them to enhance their internal program, as well as understanding what data they have can be leveraged in the future in our future interchangeable part of liquid filter, for example. So some of the typical one would be like the bacteria challenge you need to do in addition to just the data, right? So it's additional filter validation, bacteria challenge, integrity testing, as well as chemical compatibility tests. And if you do claim sterile claim, then you will do any sterility test in addition to all this work. With that said, let me pass it on to Lee.
Thanks again, Ken. Okay. So the last thing I'm going to mention with you guys is the implementation strategy, also from an end user perspective. So we've talked a lot about what the concepts are, angles, how we do it, in the details, the technical details, and supplier perspective benefits. So if you want to do it and you're an end user, how do we actually do that? Well, I can give you a look at what we've done at Thermo and kind of a recommended approach. This kind of borrows some of the concepts that we've used. Starting with creating a project team. Depending on your circumstance, this is a pretty big undertaking. It's very important. It's integral to a lot of different things that we do in managing raw materials. So it should be worth the effort, but it will take some effort. And so, we recommend to have a project team, a project charter, defined responsibilities. You're going to want a cross-functional team that has, technical understanding of the different elements, regulatory, quality assurance, MSAT, maybe operations, maybe procurement, maybe warehousing. The critical ones, though, would be like your MSAT or process engineering team, regulatory, and always QA involved. This just helps with a lot of the, having to constantly explain why we're doing this, what's the story, what's the background. If you have dedicated members that are bought in, that are, that have time committed to it, then it helps build that kind of momentum towards, trying to achieve this. Then, from the paper, you've got a lot of great information that you can use, but, you'll want to define for yourself what each of these terms mean. And we've got great definitions. And in fact, for those 4 categories that we mentioned, identical, like for like, functionally equivalent, and functional modification, I might recommend you just take our definitions. Now, you may have to change them, but they've been very much wordsmithed, and they're referenced in a BioPhorum paper. So that's kind of handy. And so I recommend you just maybe use those terms. But that doesn't make it easy to navigate for the new engineer that has to fill out the form to bring in this new component that's maybe never done it before. And so what we found is, create diagrams, create visual aids, create tools, create forms, standard documents that are intuitive, they're easy to follow, that simplify all what's going on here. And so you see kind of in that image, maybe that doesn't look simple, but the idea was that how could you understand what category you're in based on the criteria we've talked about in a very like consistent, programmatic way almost, so that a person that's never done this before can pick up the SOP and properly classify that that change level. That is so critical. That is probably the most important thing I would recommend you ensure you're able to do, is consistent evaluation of material changes. And that's at the bedrock of this whole thing, because if you're getting variation from engineer or quality person to quality person, then that means your definitions aren't good enough or your procedure is unclear. And that's where the regulatory risk is. That's where, impact to clients or delays are going to come in when there's ambiguity. So try to get as crisp as you can, make the process easy to follow so that if you're following your procedure, you always get the same result. That makes it scalable as well, right? As you go through this process and you're developing these documents and you've got your project team, a lot of communication is necessary. If you have experience in project management, over communicate, make sure you have buy-in. With people argue with you, bring them in, don't push them away. Like, get their opinion, understand where they're coming from. Try to find the middle ground where everyone can agree to, but hold on to the the science or the technology or the theory behind it. Because a lot of pushback that I've expected or I've experienced in the past is folks will say things like, well, it's compliance, not science. And I would respond by saying the health authorities expect us to use science. Of course, we have to manage, compliance, but let's not just give up. If we don't understand how to navigate something, let's try to get there. Let's try to find the middle ground where we can reach a consensus. So that's the most difficult part probably in most projects, but this is no exception. So find that alignment across your stakeholders. And then, it's GMP things. It's create an SOP, create a form. This is another diagram that you see on the screen about, how you might consider the impact of the change of a material. And this shows identical, like for like, and functionally equivalent. Doesn't show functional modification because that would be kind of out of scope a bit, if you're doing interchangeability. But it compares it against the criticality of the material you're changing. So, of course, if we're finding an interchangeable glove, that's going to be evaluated or scrutinized differently than if we find an interchangeable chromatography resin. Like, that's a whole different thing. It's not the same. So one of the things that I'd recommend is you consider layering in material complexity or material criticality into the evaluation, because even if something is deemed interchangeable, functionally equivalent, or interchangeable like for like, the actions will likely be different in how you manage that depending on that criticality. And so what, this one just shows, like, you might have a minor impact. You don't have to do, certain approvals. Whereas if you get into like a major impact or a critical impact, then, no notifications, go to notifications, go to pre-approval, or go to post-approval, pre-approval, kind of mirroring what the health authorities do. And so really, I guess theoretically, it's kind of coming back to like a risk-based approach, making sure you're evaluating that as you go through. Last point I'd mention here is just, again, communicate, be a team, work together. This is the type of program that you can't do on your own, and it needs to be a kind of a strategic goal for the organization. And there's tons of benefits, like we've mentioned, and I recommend you do it. So I think that covers the implementation strategy slides. So let me skip over back to Ken to do a conclusion, and thanks.
All right, thank you so much. All right, so on the last final stretch here. So in conclusion, what you hear so far today is that this paper offered two key elements. the first one is the definition of terminology, which is the most important one from personal experience. When I get into this topic during the pandemic time, it was so frustrating. At the end of the conversation with the supplier, we realized we're not talking about the same thing. So we were taking the definition from internal common industry language, like for example, function equivalent from the PDA TR66 functioning modification. We're trying to wrap that to define it better. And the key thing to define it better is to anchor the definition based on the end user process perspective. Otherwise, you have many different scenarios. You're not talking about the same thing, even though the component looks the same. So, and then from the second part is, with that understanding, when the supplier say this component is changed, you can take that information, understand how it fit in your process, and using this category of the four that show on the picture here to see where they fit in terms of definition for your internal stakeholder conversation. Because if you're using the wrong term, your internal stakeholder like quality, MSAT, operation, they may have different demand in terms of work that you need to do to qualify them. So it's important to speak the same language, not only with the supplier, and so also within your internal stakeholder as well. And then the second key important piece is the expected quality attributes. And we're trying to lay out as comprehensive as we can, have a common set of attributes we expect, regardless what the component you'll be getting, as well as some component-specific attributes that you want to consider if you want to implement these interchangeable pods. With that said, I want to thank you so much. And we have a lot of contributors from internal and external, as well as both supplier and end user on this paper. I'll turn it back to you, Louisa. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken, and thanks to all of our speakers today. And I know we've got a number of questions in the chat, so we'll get to those in just a second.